For the last decade, my primary body of work has been supporting Black-owned businesses. And there is one theme that keeps coming up. It comes up in our businesses and it comes up in our community. And that is some version of, why aren't we like them? If we only did what they did, we're the only ones that do whatever, fill in the blank. That level of comparison, or that type of comparison, I have always felt was detrimental to our community. But I wanted to dig in and I wanted to get really intentional about it, because I think the question can sound like an honest self-reflection or a community reflection. It sounds like a challenge for us to do better. And I understand why we ask it, because the gaps that we experience, right, the frustration in those gaps is very real. But I want to talk to you today about something that I think could permanently change how you read that question, because the comparison game that we play is very much by design. And it was engineered to produce a specific conclusion. And the conclusion it produced is that the problems that we experience are really inside of us. And the gap that we experience, those gaps are cultural. And that if we just had the right values or the right work ethic or the right community cohesion, right, we would get the same results as the people in the groups that we are being compared to. But that conclusion is wrong. And more importantly, it serves the people who built the structure that we are all navigating. So today I want to go deeper than kind of this surface level comparison. And I want to show you how the hierarchy was constructed, who built it and why, what it did to our cultural identity as Black Americans that it did not do to everyone else's, and what I believe is the right metric to view a community that has built extraordinary things under extraordinary conditions. So, if you're new here, I'm Jice Johnson, and I am a business strategist and an economic developer. And on this channel, we talk about business, leadership, and global politics. Now, these things may all sound like different topics, but in reality, they're intricately woven together and their impacts affect our daily lives. If you are new here, welcome back. And if this content is landing for you, like, subscribe, and share, and help me reach those who need to hear it. All right, so let's dig in, but I do want to warn you, today's video is actually pretty layered, so you may need to go back, you may want to take some notes. But I want to start by talking about the binary that exists before we talk about the comparison, because this really lays the groundwork and the foundation for what we experience. So the racial binary itself, that these comparisons are built on. A lot of people believe that Black and white kind of always existed to a degree in these racial categories, right? Europeans came over to Africa, they were white, we were Black, it just made sense. But that's actually not the case. These terms were invented very deliberately and by specific people for a specific purpose, and understanding that really changes everything. So I want to give us just a brief history lesson. I don't want to dig too deep, but I want us to understand the context of the binary that we exist. So in colonial Virginia, or in the 1600s, the categories that defined your social position were primarily economic and not racial. So you were an enslaved person, even if the enslaved people were coming from Africa, your category was an enslaved person, an indentured servant, a landless freedman, or a planter. And during this time, there were some things that were possible that didn't remain possible. So let me give you a couple of examples. There was a Black man named Anthony Johnson. Now, he arrived in Virginia as an indentured servant. He secured his freedom, he acquired land, and he became a respected member of his community, whatever that means. But another example, a woman named Elizabeth Key successfully appealed to the colony's legal system to free herself after she had been wrongfully enslaved. Now, what's important here is that these things were legally possible in early colonial Virginia because there was not yet a hard line between Black and white. That was not created. Now, let's jump to Bacon's Rebellion. If you don't remember Bacon's Rebellion, no judgment here. I think we probably learned it in like middle school. But in 1676, there was a multiracial alliance of Black enslaved people and white indentured servants. They united, they armed themselves, and they burned Jamestown down to the ground. Now, they were fighting at that time against the planter class who controlled the colony. And so for a moment, there were, all these people at the bottom of the economic ladder, Black and white, recognizing who their common enemy was, and they moved together. That moment terrified Virginia's elite. And what they did next was one of the most consequential political decisions in American history. Because, of course, they did not try to address the grievances that caused the rebellion. Instead, they drew a line. And that line was a racial line. They enacted laws saying that people of African descent were hereditary slaves. And then simultaneously, they gave small privileges, legal standing, and a sense of status to poor white colonists. So it was in that moment that you essentially got whiteness and Blackness invented together as oppositions to each other. And this was important because the ruling class needed to prevent that sort of cross-racial alliance from ever happening again. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary shows that the first appearance in print of the word white in reference to a person's race was in 1671. Colonial documents that were written before that period rarely use the word white to describe European colonists at all. That category did not exist in the way that we understand it today. Now, there's a historian, Theodore Allen. He writes that the white race must be understood not simply as a social construct, but as a ruling class social control formation. So it was built to divide people who had every economic reason for them to be united. Now, this matters because every community that we compare ourselves to entered a very dichotic hierarchy, and it was built on this foundation. They did not step into some sort of neutral playing field. They stepped into a system specifically organized around keeping Black people at the bottom and giving everyone else some sort of varying degree of distance from that bottom. So when we, even for those of us that travel the world, I'm actually in Mexico right now. For those of us that travel, when we talk about there being this anti-Blackness everywhere, that exists through colonization very deliberately. So yes, what you feel is accurate, but it's the why, right? So I want to talk about kind of these groups. Most importantly, I want to talk about the Europeans, but I also want to talk about the other, I really don't like the term people of color, but I want to talk about the other ethnicities. That's the best way to say it. I want to talk about the other ethnicities as well, so that we have a better understanding of how all these things kind of fit, like all the puzzle pieces fit. Now, for European immigrants, this is important because they were not originally considered to be white, right? So let's start with the Irish, because I think that's probably the most well-known example, and maybe the Italians. But Irish immigrants were not considered white when they arrived in the mid-1800s. Neither were, as I mentioned, the Italians, right? But neither were the Jewish, the Polish, the Eastern European immigrants. None of them arrived as white. They became white. And they became white through a process that I think matters because it required something specific. It was not just a legal or economic transition. It required a cultural transition, a demonstration, if you will, right? And the price of entry into whiteness was making clear publicly, often violently, that you were not with Black people. You can see this in examples like the New York draft riots in 1863. Irish immigrants attacked Black residents of New York City. Now, the economic competition was a real thing, but the attack was also a performance of loyalty to the racial hierarchy. It basically said, we're not with them, right? We're with you. And that performance has been repeated across generation and context. And this is how communities over time cross the line from immigrant into the white category. Now, this is something that's critical as we need to understand the broader picture here, right? Is that these communities got to keep their culture. They were encouraged actually to keep their culture, to maintain cultural cohesion, because that cohesion was useful to the structure. It allowed them to create things like mutual aid networks and labor organizing, political voting blocks, and their cultures were managed but not erased. And so over time, their cultural distinctiveness rather was absorbed into like the broader white American identity, but they were able to keep a little bit of their flavor, right? Which is why we have things like Greektown or Little Italy, right? Or why we celebrate St. Patty's Day with such vigor, right? Or Oktoberfest, right? These things that add a little bit of flavor, a little bit of culture to the white community. Now, we'll pin that because we're going to come back to culture. But one other important thing to note here is that the GI Bill, I want to jump up, okay? The GI Bill it has been cited as the foundation of the racial wealth gap, but it is not the foundation. I like to correct information and make sure that we're getting the facts right? It is not the foundation. It is, though, one of the most documented accelerants of the gap. But the foundation goes back further. Convict leasing, the destruction of Greenwood and Rosewood and Nicodemus, sharecropping and the exclusion of Black workers from unions and skilled trades, redlining. All of that preceded the GI Bill. And then the GI Bill happened. Now, this was the single largest federal wealth building program in American history, and Black veterans were excluded from it by the same government that sent them in to fight. So when we see this explosion of the wealth gap, right, we have a place, a pinpoint of where we saw that gap like explode. All right, I'm going to shift gears, but I'm going to come back, okay? I want to jump over to talking about some of the other ethnicities and the ways that we see them and how these gaps were created. So let's talk about the model minority. That is, if you're not familiar with that term, that's the Asian community, okay? Now, the model minority narrative is not a description of Asian communities. It is a policy outcome. The Hart-Celler Immigration Act of 1965 specifically selected for educated, credentialed, entrepreneurially positioned immigrants from Asia. So when we are looking at the Asian community, we are not comparing ourselves to a random cross-section of Asian communities globally. We are comparing ourselves to a population that was selected for achievement before they even arrived here, positioned as a useful contrast to Black Americans, and they were given immigration infrastructure that Black Americans were not given. So when we look, for example, at Korean American entrepreneurs, they built businesses in Black neighborhoods. They had access to things like rotating credit unions, GYEs. I think I'm pronouncing that right. GYE, if you would like to look that up, but I don't pronounce Korean. I don't know. I don't pronounce Korean. Y'all know what I'm saying. I don't know if it's pronounced gi, gay, guy. I don't know. But when I read it, I read gi. That's how I'm saying it. But they had access to rotating credit associations, GYEs, guys, gays, I don't know, and SBA loans at rates that were not available to Black applicants in the same communities, right? And so we see this today, like this access to capital gap still exists. Both the cultural practice and the structural access, that differential that we are experiencing has been very real, and you cannot analyze one without the other. So despite navigating very real discrimination, Asian American communities have retained their cultural identities, language, spiritual practices, food traditions, ancestral connections, right? Like the model minority construct may have pressured them towards assimilation, but it did not strip them of a cultural home that they could return to. Now let's take a look at brown communities, the Latino community, right? Now, Latino is not a racial category. It is an ethnic category, and it gets racialized differently depending on your skin color, national origin, and immigration status. So as an example of this, a light-skinned Cuban American professional and a dark-skinned undocumented Guatemalan agricultural worker are both Latino. But the structural conditions that they navigate are not comparable at all. And colorism within the Latino communities very much mirrors the proximity hierarchy, right? If you're Black, or the darker that you are, right, the darker that you are within that community affects how you're treated in that community. So the logic of the hierarchy just runs all the way through. Now, just stick with me. This is the last one, which is American Indians. They are the educated ones, right? The Indian Americans are the most educated immigrant group in America. They are also the most selected. They have H-1B visa programs that were specifically developed to recruit skilled professionals. So this community of Indians, this community of Indians, they are also very much like the Asians, not a representative of the cross section of India's population. They are curated specifically of India's most credentialed people. So again, comparing our outcomes with theirs without naming that selection process is it's structurally invalid. It's like comparing a general population against a group that is literally screened for high achievement, right? So it just doesn't hold. So I wanted to lay the groundwork of everybody just kind of understanding. One is we have this dichotomy. And then as these groups came to America, there were specific things that they were selected for, recruited for, cultivated for, allowed, that very much differs from the way that Black Americans were treated. And so we see these varying degrees of proximity to whiteness or proximity to Blackness, and efforts to propel themselves closer to whiteness in order to distance themselves from Blackness, right? So I want you to just hold that as a foundation. I mentioned this in the beginning. This is a layered conversation, but I've been sitting with it for a while, and that's why I want to give it what I think it deserves. Hold that foundation, okay? That historical foundation. Now let's talk about assimilation, right? Because again, you have all these communities that are essentially trying to propel themselves closer to whiteness, or the other word for that is assimilate. Now, I do feel like there's a dynamic that we should name, because I do believe it's felt by almost every Black American, but it's rarely articulated enough to be actionable. We as Black Americans, we have been told to assimilate. We've been told to straighten our hair, to change our speech. We are told to dress differently. We are told to adopt professional presentation and communication styles and the aesthetic of white culture. And the implicit promise that is underneath all of that is that if you get close enough to the standard, you will then be accepted. You will be seen. You will be included. Now, that promise was never real. It's not real to us, and it's not real to anyone else that is in this hierarchy, right? It's not real. It never was intended to be real. But, because the marker of the inferiority in this hierarchy is not behavior, right? Even for the ones who have been selected for their behavior, for their achievement, for their entrepreneurial, endeavors or spirit, right? But the reality of it is, and I want to. It applies across the board. I think that's what I'm trying to say. It applies across the board, but I want to be specific about how it affects our community. Because the promise of closing this gap, the promise of being included, the promise of being accepted, that was just not real. The marker of inferiority in this hierarchy is not behavior. It is the body itself. You cannot assimilate out of Blackness, no matter how many boxes that you check, no matter how perfectly you perform the standard is going to move. The acceptance is never going to arrive. The gap between the performance and the acceptance produces a very specific kind of psychological exhaustion that compounds across our lifetimes and across our generations, right? We are not the first or the second or the third generate, like we're multiple generations into this promise, into this concept of respectability politics that just isn't real. And even when we have rejected the concept of respectability politics, it just takes on a different name. It just takes on a different way that we behave. And what I believe is that this produces what I have been calling a subservient posturing, right? An approval seeking, proximity chasing orientation that shows up in how we talk about ourselves and how we present ourselves and how we evaluate each other. And I want to be clear about this. I don't think that this is a character flaw in us. It is a rational response, right? Which is why I mentioned the other groups, because again, when we look at their anti-Black positioning, right, as a way to propel themselves closer to whiteness, this is a rational response to a violent system that has trained generations to believe that the right behavior would eventually help close the gap and that the right behavior could save themselves from some level of violence as well. But the issue is that the gap doesn't close and the training doesn't stop. And what all it does is really produce more exhaustion. Other communities of color, as I have said, carry this burden, but there is a critical difference, and that difference is they have a cultural home to return to. So when the burden of assimilation becomes too heavy, they have a language, they have a spiritual practice, they have a food tradition, right? They have an ancestral story that says who they are, regardless of what this country is telling them. And I don't think that that grounding is a small thing. I think it is the difference between bending under pressure and breaking under it. I'm reading this book right now, and I will likely share when I get to the end of it. But I'm reading this book by Bell Hooks about Black self-esteem, right? And so it's continuing to give me other or broaden perspective about essentially what it is that I'm talking about here. Because this comparison game that we are constantly playing, it just doesn't benefit us, right? So when we're talking from the cultural aspect, it's important for us to recognize that Black Americans were deliberately stripped of that anchor. Matter of fact, the U.S. model of slavery specifically aimed to break familial ties, eradicate languages, and erase religious and cultural practices. Scholars have described its goal as producing a new kind of being. Okay, it wanted to create something when it created the Black American. It wanted to create a culturally void, socially isolated, and politically neutralized being. The assimilation demand lands on a people who have no alternative foundation to stand on. So the pull towards whiteness and the pull towards proximity and the pull towards acceptance becomes very much gravitational. And it's not because we are weak, it's because we haven't had an alternative to take. So I love the way that I see, even right now, our communities trying to find our way back, right, into these roots, which creates a very interesting clash that I'm now going to add my next layer on top of. All right. So layered, the next layer. I want to talk about what's going on with this culturally, because nearly everything that we consider Black American culture is a combination of disconnected African culture that was adapted, transformed, and rebuilt under conditions of erasure. So I want to be clear on what I'm saying. Our people here tried to hold on to these traditions, tried to hold on to culture. And because we were mixed and mingled and sold and tortured and brutalized in such ways, and our culture, our language, our heritage, our religion, all of these things were being erased, right? The grips and pieces of all of these things that we've been able to hold on to, is what we have created. We've created these things without language. We've created these things without geography. We have created these things without ancestral lineage that has been anchored to it, right? We have created these things under conditions that have been gut wrenching. gut wrenching. I mean, every time that I read about or learn more about our history, there is an aspect of feeling sick to my stomach, and also what I recognize is that what we have created under those conditions is quite literally nothing short of extraordinary. We have become the most influential culture on the planet, right? Jazz, rock and roll, hip hop, AAVE, being now a part of mainstream speech, Black aesthetic driving global beauty trends, Black style becoming high fashion, right? All of this was built under conditions of suppression. This has become the cultural engine of the modern world. And simultaneously, it is also the most consistently devalued and dismissed as ghetto and ratchet and hood and unprofessional when we do it, right? When we do it. When other cultures, even even when they have faced even when they have faced vehement discrimination, because I don't take that lightly. I don't take it lightly that the way that this discrimination has been dished out upon the world, right? When they have faced vehement discrimination, they have still retained this sort of designation of dignity, right? Like Italian food is elegant cuisine, right? Chinese medicine is ancient wisdom. Indian fashion is exotic and beautiful. Irish music is heritage, right? Black American cultural products are framed as problems until they are profitable. And then that profit goes elsewhere. The industries that control the distribution and the monetization of Black culture and Black cultural products, what we have produced, right, have historically been owned and operated by people who are not Black. Mostly they're Jewish. That ownership structure means that the economic returns from Black cultural production are flowing disproportionately outside of our communities. The gatekeepers who decide what gets amplified, what gets dismissed, they have interests that are fundamentally misaligned with our community interests. And there is a cycle. Black culture, is created at the bottom, right? That is what has happened in our society. That our culture has been created from the bottom, from the pain, from the the anguish, right, and the brutality, right. This is where our culture has been created. It's been extracted, it's been repackaged, and it's been distributed at scale, and a profit margin that the original creators of our works never see. Then we have a new generation of Black brilliance, right? And it starts the cycle again under the same gatekeeping structure, because the infrastructure to distribute and monetize Black culture on Black terms, it just doesn't exist at scale. And of course, I don't think the solution is to stop creating, right? I think the solution is to build the ownership structures that changes who captures the value. But that is a strategic conversation. So I'm going to layer this on one more layer, and I think I'm done with the layering. But one more comparison that I think is worth naming is this tension between Black Americans and Black immigrants, right? So we get the tension between Black Americans and some of the other ethnic communities, right? Just understanding where they come from can help with what that looks like. But at the end of the day, the outcomes are what the outcomes are. And that discrimination makes some sense. The comparison, I said discrimination, that's not what I meant. The comparison makes sense. The frustration around the comparison makes sense. But the comparison that doesn't make sense to me is the comparison between Black Americans and Black immigrants. And I feel this frustration every time I see this come up. I'm not going to talk about FBA, but I see it in FBA all the time. And this is why I feel like right now FBA, which had a specific purpose, is really like the ops at this point. But that's not what I'm talking about. So let me come back to the Black immigrants and Black Americans, right? Black immigrants, they Black immigrants read Black Americans, are proximity seeking, as very as weak and as a cultural problem that is specific to us, despite the fact that they also struggle with that. We can see that in what's going on in South Africa right now, for example, right? So they have also struggled under this proximity to whiteness, proximity seeking, right? But I think that there is a more complete picture that we're missing. Many Black immigrants arrive having already consumed Western media's portrayal of Black Americans before they've even set foot here. That portrayal is the same devaluing, criminalizing narrative that we have to navigate domestically, right? It's just exported globally. And it is this narrative, right? It is in place by the same system that has oppressed us. It's like the propaganda is doing exactly what it was designed to do. They also experience a hardship in a different way than what we experience here, right? Like an immigrant who grew up without reliable electricity, without paved roads, without consistent running water, they have a different relationship to American conditions, which can make the psychological injuries of culture erasure harder for them to read as the serious harm that they are. It's not because the injuries are not real to our community, it's because the frame of reference is just different, right? And so what I want both of our communities to hold is the hardship is different, but the root of it is the same. This is colonial extraction created the infrastructure collapse that drives immigration from Africa and the Caribbean, right? That same colonial extraction is the same colonial slavery that created the cultural erasure Black Americans are navigating. So the colonial, like, I don't even get it. Like, what are we even talking about? What are we even talking about? The the division between us is not natural. It's not natural. It's literally the same hand. The division between us is not natural. It's manufactured. When we understand that, when we understand that we are all downstream of the same extraction, we can stop measuring each other's damage and start to see the common thread, right? So I wanted to end on that. I wanted to end on understanding. I think there's a space where we just need to understand. And we need to understand that all of this division plays into the system. And it's the wrong metric. It's the wrong metric for us to be comparing ourselves, right? Comparing ourselves to how other groups are doing or what other groups have, right? It's like if we see the Asian community doing well, like that's taking from our community when the structure was set up to put distance between the Asian community and the Black community, but still not to have amassed more than the white community. They don't want us to work together, right? So let me bring this back to like the original question, right? Like, why can't we do what they did? Or if we only did, whatever, right? When we compare Black American outcomes to the other communities' outcomes, we are not measuring capability. We are not measuring culture or work ethic or community cohesion, right? Like if only we could, right? Like that idea that if we just did something different, we are measuring the distance between where structural access landed and where it stopped. We are measuring the difference between communities that retained cultural anchoring by design and a community whose anchoring was by design deliberately severed. We are measuring the outcomes of a hierarchy that was invented specifically to produce this gap and then points to the gap as evidence of inferiority, right? Look at you. You don't have anything. Why? Because you're lazy. Why? Because you're less intelligent. Why? Because you don't get along. Why? Because your spending habits are bad. Why? Because you're violent. Why? Because you're criminals, right? This is what that gap was designed. It has nothing to do with these other cultures. These other cultures have what they were allowed to have. The comparison is a designed distraction. If we are measuring ourselves against other communities' outcomes, we are not building a strategy based on our actual position. We are performing an analysis that was engineered to produce a predetermined conclusion. That the problem is internal, that the gap is cultural, and that conclusion serves everyone who benefits from this structure staying intact. So this is a talking point we have to drop together. What is the right metric? The right metric, given the conditions that we are actually in, the documented history of construction and destruction, the deliberate erasure of cultural anchoring, and the extraction of cultural production. What have we built? And what would we build if those conditions changed? That's the question. Considering all the things that we need to consider, what have we built? And what would we build if those conditions changed? When we measure against our own conditions, right? When we measure against our own conditions, our record is not one of failure. It's not one of failure. It doesn't matter how they try to frame it. Our record is not one of failure. HBCUs were built when we were legally excluded from white institutions. The Black press was built when mainstream media refused to cover us as being fucking human beings. Black Wall Street was built inside the constraints of legal segregation. 191 businesses, right? The civil rights movement was built without billionaires. The Rainbow Coalition was built across lines that were supposed to be unbridgeable, under conditions specifically designed to prevent accumulation. We have built. Under these conditions, we have built. And every time we have built something significant, the response was to destroy it or to co-opt it. Wall Street was burned. COINTELPRO was dismantled our organizing infrastructure, right? Integration opened up doors and destroyed our captive market. That was what was keeping our parallel economic ecosystem very viable, right? The culture that we created was extracted and profited from by industries that we don't own. The pattern, build, destroy, restart. It is not evidence of cultural inadequacy, despite what they say. It is actually evidence of the opposite. It is evidence of the threat that Black institutional power represents to the hierarchy. You do not burn down what you are not afraid of. The pattern is the metric. The question is not why aren't we like them, or why can't we do what they do, or if we only just. The question is, what are we building together with intention toward a future that we are designing rather than one being designed around us? What ownership infrastructure are we building so that the next generation of Black cultural creators does not hand their work over to a gatekeeping structure that was never accountable to them? What collective vehicles are we building so that the next time something is profitable, we capture it? That is the standard. We have to measure ourselves towards that. I'm going to close on this. I'm going to beat a dead horse. That's what I'm going to do. We have to stop measuring ourselves against a people that entered in this system through a different door. We have to stop measuring ourselves against communities whose proximity to whiteness gave them access that we were structurally denied. We have to stop letting a comparison that was engineered to diminish us function as our standards of success. Whiteness was invented to divide. The hierarchy was built to extract. The comparison was designed to extract and distract. The culture that was built, despite all of that, is the most influential culture on the planet. That is who we are. The metric is not them. The metric has never been them. The metric is us, measured against our own conditions, our own history, and our own extraordinary capacity to build under circumstances designed to prevent us from building. So if this reframe has landed for you, I encourage you to share this video. There are people in your circle who are still asking the wrong question because they are still using the wrong metric. So let's change that for us. As I close this out, I want to invite you to like and subscribe and share and do all the things that you do on YouTube to help and support. But also, if you are interested in joining me live, I do a live every other week on my Substack during my deep dive, where I go into topics that I'm continuing to explore. This is live. It's every 2 weeks. It's for my paid subscribers only. This is the link. You can find that in my bio. Also, check out my Substack, though, because I do have a ton of things that are not gatekept. I do not gatekeep, but I encourage that if this is supportive to you, helpful to you, then that is a way to support the work. Also, last thing that I'll mention before I close this video out is I would love to see you in Atlanta for our Go Global conference. That is September 30th through October 3rd. If you are interested in doing cross-border business, I will be in the room and I will be excited to meet some of you in person and continue to grow economically and globally. All right, y'all. Until the next one.